Season 1, Episode 5, The Tell, is a nice stopping point before some larger events and lets us spend time with a broader range of characters. Jackson and Lydia are at the video store, which is such a strong relic of the aughts. Jackson comes across a dead body of the store owner and is nearly attacked by the Alpha, but it's distracted or intrigued by Jackson's scars and breaks away. Stiles and the sheriff arrive at the scene of the crime, and Scott and Derek secretly watch nearby, and I just thought this line was cool.
Right? We don't go out in the middle of the night murdering everyone, do we?
No. We're predators. You don't have to be killers.
As they walk away, a spiral is revealed on the roof, and we might have seen this pattern before. Scott and Derek debrief at the Hale house. Scott says that just because he was concerned about someone's life before doesn't mean he should now be tasked with finding the Alpha, even though, according to Derek, it would be impossible without him. Derek fires back that Scott is in some way the chosen one. He is the only one with a real chance of finding the Alpha because of his connection to it. So Scott's rejection of this is tied to a larger rejection of his fate in this metaphorical hero's journey. During this conversation, Derek teaches Scott that one way to control his shift is to hurt himself, because pain is the trigger for keeping you human. The next day, Kate, who still has some apologizing to do for the previous episode's events, gives Allison her birthday present early in the form of a family heirloom.
See that?
Yeah.
You ever want to learn a little something about your family? Look it up.
At school, Scott learns it's Allison's birthday and suggests they skip school and celebrations, since Allison hates admitting that she's a year older than everyone else. I wonder if it was deliberately written into the script to explain why Crystal Reed might look older than the rest of the high school characters. I also think Scott skipping school is a symptom of his desire for things to return back to normal by avoiding the situation. Jackson's return to class is unexpected given his traumatic encounter. Stiles notices that Lydia has not been in school all day and Mr. Harris is a jackass.
Mr. Stalinsky, try putting the highlighter down between paragraphs. It's chemistry, not a coloring book.
Besides Jackson's mental wounds, the scratches from Derek's claws have still not healed. Derek sneaks onto campus again and threatens Jackson. He makes Jackson repeat that he didn't see anything during the Alpha attack until Derek supposedly can't tell that he's lying. I interpreted this in two ways, that either Derek is really trying to understand just how much Jackson saw, or that he's forcing Jackson to lie about what he saw in order to keep him from exposing the truth about werewolves. Stiles finally gets in touch with Scott, points out that things are afoot, and Scott has a responsibility to do something about it. Scott, who already spent so much time badgering Allison to skip the day, can't really do anything now, not that he would want to, and deflects. Scott has taken Allison to the woods, which I guess is romantic if you forget that Scott has a horrible memory of this place. Stiles visits Lydia, who is extremely high on some medication drugs. It's funny at first, but is a result of her encounter last night, and Stiles tries to deduce if she actually saw the Alpha with no luck. Then this weird scene happens where he makes to leave, Lydia asks him to stay, and her drunk flirting makes Stiles think something's going to happen. Luckily, it doesn't, because Lydia is in no state of mind to consent to anything. And then after that, Stiles finds a video on Lydia's phone that happened to get a recording of the Alpha from that night. Kate Argent and her posse break into Derek's home. Again, I wonder how he lives in the burnt remains of his family home. Is there running water, electricity? Kate tortures Derek just a bit before getting to the interrogation part, which is that she wants Derek to tell her who the Alpha is. And she also tells Derek that they didn't kill Laura Hale, which comes as a surprise.
You might as well admit what you've been guessing all along, which is the Alpha killed your sister.
And then they have this exchange.
You think I'm lying?
Would it be the first time?
Which implies to some degree that Derek already knows who Kate is and has been lied to by her before. By the time Kate realizes that Derek doesn't know who the Alpha is, rendering him useless, Derek has escaped the house before she can kill him. And it's really sad. I don't usually feel bad for Derek, but this episode puts into perspective just how tragic his introduction to the story is. He's an orphan who's lost almost every person he calls family, he has no one else to rely on, and now his life is at risk again. Doesn't mean he has to be an asshole to teenagers, but these scenes do a good job reminding you of just how much pressure Derek is under. Stiles is faced with a moral dilemma. After stealing Lydia's phone, he has to decide whether to leave the video of the Alpha on her phone, risking exposure of werewolves and putting Scott's life at risk, or deleting the video and kind of covering up a crime. Ultimately, Stiles deletes the video, but not before leaving Scott, whose phone has been off, a voicemail because he doesn't want to make the decision by himself. Dr. Deaton, the latest victim of Scott's truancy, is visited by the sheriff again. He's becoming more suspicious of the animal attacks, as this time they caught the creature in the form of a man, or at least walking on two legs. But Deaton seems evasive and is probably hiding more than we think. While Scott and Allison are ecstatic about their day off, Scott realizes that the parent-teacher conferences are happening tonight and they rush back to school. And the parent-teacher conferences are a really interesting way to finish off what has been a relatively calm episode. From Jackson to Lydia to Stiles, Allison, and Scott, each discussion is a brief look into their journey so far. I'll try my best to summarize. Jackson is spiraling from the recent events in his life, while his parents admit that he is adopted and this has led to an inherent need to please authority figures. Mr. Harris comments that recently Jackson's behavior has become almost obsessive. While Lydia's divorced parents expect to hear reports of erratic behavior or bad grades, seemingly a projection of their issues with each other, Lydia is in fact revealed to be a stellar student and a great leader. This pairs with the scene of her building back up her metaphorical armor. Of course, as much as it is armor, it is also a facade. Stiles' evaluation is a bit more predictable. While he can be incredibly focused, determined, and apply his intelligence, he's unable to do so at school. While Coach talks about Stiles' inability to perform, Stiles himself is trying to understand the details surrounding the fire at the Hale House.
You named your kid Stiles Stalinsky?
No. That's just what he likes to be called.
Oh, well, I like to be called Cupcake.
Melissa McCall, the only single mom, is notably more judged than her counterparts. Mr. Harris implies that Scott needs a male authority figure, to which we learn that the reason behind the parents' divorce has something to do with Scott's dad's behavior. Regardless, Harris displays an unusual level of emotional competency and points out that Scott is going through a lot of changes at this point in his life and just needs a little extra attention, some kind of guiding hand. Of course, this has a double meaning. While Harris is referring to Scott's teenage troubles, the audience knows that Scott needs some supernatural guidance as well. And then there's Allison. She hasn't gone through a recent emotional upheaval, but she has recently become less obedient than her parents would like to think.
And let her know that I hope she's feeling better.
She wasn't in class?
Oh, she wasn't at school. I checked with the office.
The judgment of Melissa McCall continues as both her and the Argents try to find their kids.
You're his mother?
Funny how you say that like it's an accusation.
Before Scott and Allison can be thoroughly punished, a scream rings out across the parking lot. The crowd is in a panic. We hear the unmistakable sounds of a wolf and are caught in suspense as to what will happen next. The sheriff tries to get in front of the animal wherever it is, but is hit by a car before he can stay alert. He pulls out his gun, and the screen cuts as we hear the sound of a gunshot. And it didn't come from the sheriff, but from Chris Argent. And instead of a wolf, the animal in question is a mountain lion. The scene is a heavy reminder to Allison of the secrets her family is keeping, and to Scott of the danger he faces from the hunters. This episode is about deception and making that choice to deceive. Scott is lying to himself, believing that he can continue living a normal life and ignore the recent murders. Stiles deletes the video evidence of the Alpha, which hurts people like Jackson, Lydia, and the sheriff as they search for answers. Derek intimidates Jackson into lying about seeing the Alpha. It's not a stretch to say Dr. Deaton is probably lying to the sheriff about the wolf attacks. Allison has recently found out that her family is lying to her, though she doesn't know why or the extent of it. And then the person who should be lying the most is actually the only one telling the truth.
We didn't kill her. You think I'm lying?
That's why this episode is called The Tell, referring to this conversation between Scott and Allison.
I'd know if you were lying anyway.
Oh, really?
You have a tell.
Knowing that the consequences of Scott's actions haven't yet fully been shown, it's hard for me to watch him make bad decisions. Of course, this is his story. I don't want him to be wrong. But it's obvious that Scott isn't just skipping school to celebrate Allison's birthday, it's also to take a break from his problems. And the impact of this is felt most by Stiles. Stiles is starting to resent Scott. While he wants to live vicariously through Scott's love life, Stiles is starting to see Allison as a distraction from Scott's supposed duties. This episode doesn't touch too much on that, but Stiles feels lost even if he doesn't understand why. I've spoken before about how Stiles, as a reflection of Scott, often makes judgments about what Scott should do, and what Stiles would do if he were in Scott's position, but doesn't always make the same choices when he is put in that same position. Part of his arc is understanding that him and Scott won't always make the same choices because they are not the same people. Scott has gone through a trauma, Stiles has not. It's easier to judge from the outside in. Even though the show has worked to already make Stiles better understand Scott's position, this episode continues to reflect this dynamic. Stiles resents Scott for not checking in on Lydia or Jackson, even though it's safe to say that Stiles checking in on Lydia is more of a reflection of Scott taking care of Allison for her birthday. They're not necessarily doing these things because of a higher sense of purpose, but because they have crushes. For me, the most interesting part of this arc in this episode comes when Stiles has to make a decision about the recording. Stiles calls Scott and says this.
Look, I found something and I don't know what to do, okay?
I think it's important to point out that as much as Stiles is angry at Scott for ignoring him, he's unwilling to make an important decision without him. Stiles says that I don't know what to do, meaning that he still relies on Scott to make the harder decisions. This is something that I have pointed out before as a natural part of Stiles' personality. He'll make a claim, Scott will make the actual decision, and Stiles will recalibrate. Here, Stiles is put in a Scott-like position, whether to delete the recording or not, and he almost doesn't make it at all. But Stiles ultimately choosing to delete the video, I think, is evidence of him wanting to do good, in the same way that he pushes Scott to care more about the mysterious murders. Just like Scott, Stiles needs a guiding hand, and relying on just Scott won't help him. I think this is why we start to see Scott turn to Derek more, because ultimately he, too, can't solely rely on Stiles to get through this, and maybe the act of Scott shifting his attention to both Derek and Allison in order to learn how to balance his new life is ironically what's causing Stiles to harbor resentment.
He wouldn't tell me.
But he's your best friend.
We'll see in the next episode how this resentment plays out, but for now I wanted to pay attention to how the mystery of this season has been tackled so far. I love this specific storytelling tool where everyone has part of the story but no one has the full story. For example, Kate and Derek are both looking for the Alpha, but neither of them know who the Alpha is. But Kate doesn't know that Derek doesn't know, which forces this confrontation between them in this episode. And while the Argents know that they need to somehow use Derek to get to the Alpha, they don't know how Scott is involved or that he's involved at all. And then there's the question of how did Laura Hale die, and the truth behind the Hale family fire, and what Dr. Deaton might be hiding, and on and on and on. One thing's for sure, we can finally stop asking about mountain lions.
So I hear they're saying it's some type of animal attack. Probably a cougar?
I heard mountain lion.
A cougar is a mountain lion.
Everyone's just saying it's a mountain lion. Something like a mountain lion?
What do you think did that? A mountain lion?